This evening, we delve into the life of Abraham Lincoln, the modest rail-splitter who ascended to become the 16th President of the United States and transformed a fractured nation. From a log cabin nestled in the Kentucky wilderness to the resonant words of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's narrative is one marked by sorrow, victory, and an unwavering quest for unity. Before you settle in, as is customary, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you appreciate this type of serene, contemplative storytelling. Additionally, we invite you to share your location and the current time for you. At times, these narratives are so captivating that we lose sight of their purpose to help us relax. Now it is time to dim the lights, activate a fan for some soothing background noise, and let us discuss what we have prepared for tonight together. It all commenced in the tranquil hills of Kentucky. On February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin near the small town of Hodgenville, a child was born into destitution. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He would eventually rise to lead a nation, yet that future seemed impossibly distant as he took his first breaths on the cold earthen floor of a frontier home. His family was impoverished, so much so that even candles were considered a luxury. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a roving carpenter and farmer, a stern individual who labored with his hands and held a strong belief in hard work. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was kind, nurturing, and profoundly spiritual. From her, Abraham inherited a sense of quiet contemplation that would accompany him throughout his life. The Lincolns moved frequently, pursuing land and opportunities, first in Kentucky and then across the Ohio River into Indiana. The terrain was rugged, life was challenging. They cleared fields manually, sowed crops, constructed fences, and endeavored to survive each winter with just enough sustenance. Then, when Abraham was merely 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother became ill with milk sickness, a fatal ailment resulting from consuming the milk of cows that had grazed on a toxic plant. She passed away swiftly, and the loss profoundly affected the essence of family was deeply ingrained in him. For Abraham, it left an unseen scar that never fully mended. He bore that sorrow silently, intertwining it with the sadness that defined his character. However, the light returned to the Lincoln household when his father took a kind widow named Sarah Bush Johnston as his new wife. She infused the family with warmth and order, and she introduced books into their lives. She recognized something in young Abe, a thoughtful and inquisitive nature. While Thomas Lincoln wished for his son to wield an axe, Sarah motivated him to delve into literature, and he did so repeatedly. The boy from the log cabin lacked sophisticated tutors, elegant attire, and sufficient schooling. Yet he possessed an insatiable desire to learn. In a society that anticipated him to cultivate fields and fade into obscurity, Abraham Lincoln began to develop quietly, not just in stature but in spirit. It was a modest start, but even the tallest trees originate from the tiniest seeds, and Lincoln was merely starting to ascend. Abraham Lincoln was raised amidst silence, dense forests, harsh winters, and the unhurried pace of frontier existence. Yet within that silence, something awakened. While other boys were busy swinging axes and pursuing game, Abraham could often be found beneath a tree, a book resting on his lap, absorbed in a realm far removed from the wilderness. Formal education was nearly absent in the backwoods of Indiana. In total, Lincoln might have received less than a year of conventional schooling. Nevertheless, he did not allow that to hinder him. He would borrow any book he could find, sometimes traveling miles just to read a few treasured pages. The Bible, Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, and later Shakespeare all served as his quiet mentors. His stepmother Sarah observed this. She once remarked that Abraham read every book he could find and would recite them verbatim. She saw something in him that others overlooked, an almost sacred desire to comprehend the world, to make sense of matters that most boys never even pondered. However, life was not simple for a boy who preferred reading to fighting. His father Thomas did not entirely grasp Abraham's passion for books. He esteemed hard work over deep thinking. While Abraham completed his chores, splitting rails, hauling water, and tending to animals, his thoughts frequently drifted elsewhere. He envisioned far-off lands, ancient heroes, justice, honor, and freedom. People remarked on his peculiar nature. He was tall, awkward, and remarkably strong, yet quiet, almost reserved. When he did speak, his words bore a significance beyond his years. His neighbors were perplexed by this lanky individual who could recite entire passages of poetry and then out-wrestle the strongest man in the county, yet beneath his calm demeanor and courteous manner lay a restless spirit. Lincoln was not content with the life he had inherited. The log cabin had taught him survival, but the books had taught him to think and, more crucially, to dream. He once wrote, "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who will get me a book I haven't read." It was within those pages illuminated by candlelight that Abraham Lincoln first began to mold the mind and heart that would one day lead a nation through its darkest hour. By the time Abraham Lincoln reached his early 20s, he was tall, remarkably tall. At 64, he wore clothes that seldom fit properly. His pants were always slightly too short and his sleeves a bit too loose. His face was lean and weathered, and his voice had a slow, contemplative rhythm. He resembled a man sculpted from the very trees he once split. In 1831, Lincoln arrived in the small frontier town of New Salem, Illinois. He possessed no money, no formal education, and no definitive plan. However, he had something far more potent than a resume. People took to him almost immediately. He secured a position as a store clerk, and although the store was not consistently busy, Abe made a lasting impression. He was renowned for his honesty to a fault. If someone overpaid by a few cents, he would walk miles to return the excess. If he borrowed a book or tool, he always returned it, sometimes in better condition than when he received it. His integrity earned him the nickname Honest Abe. Yet it was not solely his honesty that endeared him to others, it was also his wit. He shared stories, long, winding, and humorous tales, that allowed people to forget their worries and lean in closer. He possessed a talent for language and timing, transforming even the simplest anecdotes into unforgettable narratives. He was neither polished nor formally educated. Nevertheless, in New Salem, Lincoln began to cultivate something significant: trust. People sought him out for advice, laughter, and eventually, leadership. In 1832, he ran for the state legislature. He lost, but he did not fade away. 2 years later, he made another attempt, and this time he succeeded. In the interim, he served briefly in the Black Hawk War, not as a combatant, but as a captain. He never engaged in battle, yet he was elected by the men, another indication of the faith people had in him. Lincoln's time in New Salem was brief, yet it was foundational. It was there that he experienced the initial taste of public life. There, that reserved boy who read by the light of the fire transformed into a man whose words commanded attention. He was no longer merely recounting tales. He was starting to compose one of his own. Following his time in New Salem, Abraham Lincoln aspired to something greater: the law. Lacking a formal education, a classroom, or a mentor, he instead pursued knowledge independently, borrowing legal texts and poring over them late into the night, reminiscent of his boyhood studies of poetry and scripture. By 1836, he successfully passed the Illinois bar exam and became a licensed attorney. Springfield, Illinois, emerged as his new residence, a vibrant town brimming with energy, politics, and ambition. In this setting, Lincoln affiliated himself with a law firm and began to handle a diverse array of cases, including property disputes, debts, assaults, and even murder trials. He swiftly garnered a reputation as a competent, fair, and principled lawyer. In court, he communicated in straightforward terms, employed humor when appropriate, and refrained from humiliating his adversaries, even when he outwitted them. However, Springfield's influence extended beyond Lincoln's professional life. It also touched his heart. It was in this town that he encountered Mary Todd, an educated woman hailing from an affluent Kentucky family. Mary was unlike anyone Lincoln had previously met. She was astute, self-assured, and shared his passion for politics. Their relationship was fraught with complexity, marked by engagement, separation, and eventual reconciliation. Some of Lincoln's acquaintances speculated that he doubted his worthiness for her, while others believed he feared he could not provide her with the life she merited. Nevertheless, on November 4, 1842, they wed. Their marriage was characterized by both fervor and turbulence. Mary possessed a fiery temperament and battled emotional instability, while Lincoln, though composed, often grappled with feelings of melancholy. They loved each other profoundly, yet endured numerous challenging seasons together. They were blessed with 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. However, heartbreak would strike the family once more. Edward passed away at the tender age of 4. Willie, who was perhaps Lincoln's favorite, succumbed to illness in the White House at the age of 11. Only Robert would reach adulthood. Beneath the courtroom triumphs and his ascending public career, Lincoln bore a profound private grief. He often remained silent, spending extensive hours in solitude. Friends characterized his melancholy as a constant presence, akin to a shadow trailing closely behind. Yet despite all this, he persevered. He had started to recognize that the law encompassed more than mere regulations and debates. It was fundamentally about individuals, about equity, about justice and injustice. Deep within, Lincoln was already envisioning a nation that could embody greater justice than the one he had inherited. By the mid-1850s, America was fracturing under the burden of its own contradictions. It proclaimed itself the land of freedom, yet millions remained in bondage. The discourse surrounding slavery had evolved beyond mere political debate. It was transforming into a national identity crisis, and Abraham Lincoln, once a one-term congressman, found himself irresistibly drawn back into the fray. Initially, Lincoln had refrained from speaking out with vigor. He abhorred slavery, deeming it morally reprehensible, yet he did not perceive himself as a radical. What he firmly believed, with both clarity and conviction, was that slavery should not be allowed to expand. This conviction was what propelled him back into the public spotlight. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which permitted new territories to determine for themselves whether to permit slavery. To Lincoln, this was not merely poor policy. It represented a betrayal of the founding principles. He began to speak out once more, initially in a subdued manner, then with increasing strength and determination. Then came 1858, the year of the Lincoln Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas was an experienced senator, charismatic and self-assured. Lincoln, the challenger, appeared plain in comparison. However, when they convened for 7 open-air debates across Illinois, Lincoln astonished everyone. He did not raise his voice. He did not resort to insults. He presented his arguments calmly, persistently, and forcefully. He posed the question, can a nation remain half slave and half free? He did not believe it could. Although Lincoln did not win the Senate race, his words resonated far beyond Illinois. Newspapers nationwide published his arguments. People began to discuss this tall, awkward lawyer from the Midwest who spoke with honesty and moral clarity. By 1860, he was being considered for the highest office in the nation. The Republican Party recognized in Lincoln something exceptional, a man who opposed slavery without animosity, who spoke firmly yet not cruelly. He was not the frontrunner, but in a fragmented field he emerged as the nominee. Then on a frigid November night in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the 16th President of the United States. The South did not wait for him to assume office. Within a matter of weeks, states commenced the process of secession. The Union, the very concept of the United States, was disintegrating. Lincoln had not yet entered the White House, yet he was already stepping into the annals of history. When Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency in March of 1861, he entered a nation that was on the brink of collapse. 7 southern states had seceded even before he placed his hand on the Bible. More states were expected to follow. They perceived his presidency as a threat to their way of life, particularly regarding the institution of slavery. Lincoln did not desire war, he sought unity. However, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in April, the decision was made for him. The Civil War had commenced. He had never led an army, commanded troops, or studied warfare. Yet the destiny of a nation now rested upon his shoulders. He read military literature at night, consulted generals during the day, and made challenging decisions, often in solitude and with significant doubt. The war continued, and it was merciless. With each battle, the death toll increased. Young boys from both the North and the South marched into muddy fields and never returned. Cities were set ablaze. Families were torn asunder. Brothers fought against brothers. It had transcended a mere political disagreement. It had become a human tragedy. Lincoln encountered pressure from all directions. Newspapers ridiculed him. Political adversaries accused him of tyranny. Even members of his own cabinet questioned his leadership. He dismissed general after general in search of someone who could meet the urgency of the moment. At home, he mourned. In 1862, his cherished son Willie succumbed to typhoid fever within the White House. Lincoln, already susceptible to melancholy, was heartbroken. He isolated himself, sometimes visiting Willie's grave during the late hours of the night. Yet, he persevered. Amidst this turmoil, he executed one of the most audacious actions in American history. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln proclaimed the Emancipation Proclamation. It announced that all enslaved individuals in territories held by the Confederacy were now liberated. While it did not abolish slavery immediately, it transformed the nature of the war. It shifted the conflict into a moral struggle, not merely to preserve the Union, but to redefine it. Lincoln famously stated, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." With that proclamation, he placed the full authority of the presidency behind that conviction. His aim was not solely to achieve victory in a war. He aspired to win the very essence of a nation. As the conflict continued, Abraham Lincoln grasped a profound truth. Battles may determine the outcome of a war, but words possess the power to mold the spirit of a nation. He had always been a man of deliberate speech, selecting each word with care. However, in 1863, on a battlefield drenched in blood, he would deliver a speech that would endure through time. The Battle of Gettysburg was among the most lethal of the war. More than 50,000 soldiers were killed, injured, or unaccounted for. The town bore the scars. The fields transformed into burial grounds. In November, months after the battle concluded, Lincoln journeyed to Gettysburg to consecrate a national cemetery. He was not the primary speaker. That honor went to a renowned orator who spoke for over 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose. He retrieved a folded sheet of paper from his coat and commenced his address. His voice was soft, and the speech lasted scarcely 2 minutes. Merely 272 words. No elaborate gestures, no theatrical embellishments, just clarity, purpose, and poetry. 47 years ago, he began by referencing the founding of the nation. He reminded the audience and the country that this war was not solely about maintaining the Union. It was centered on establishing that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not vanish from the earth. It served as a promise, a reminder, and a challenge. Initially, many remained silent. Some were uncertain about how to interpret such a brief address. However, as time passed, those words evolved into something greater. They were recited in classrooms, inscribed on monuments, and memorized by successive generations. During a period of turmoil, Lincoln provided clarity. in an era of animosity. He offered dignity. He did not speak to defeat his adversaries. He spoke to uplift the living, to impart significance to the fallen. The Gettysburg Address transcended mere speech. It marked a pivotal moment, not just in the war, but in the formation of national identity. Lincoln redefined the essence of being American, not merely bound by geography, but united by shared ideals. He held the conviction that words possess the power to heal, and with 272 carefully chosen words, he assisted a mourning nation in beginning to recall what it represented. By early 1865, the conclusion of the war was finally becoming apparent. After 4 arduous, bloody years, the Union forces were advancing towards the Confederacy. Cities had succumbed, supply lines were disintegrating, and with each passing week, the South's resistance started to weaken. Yet Abraham Lincoln did not rejoice. He felt weary, not only physically but also spiritually. The war had taken its toll on him. His face was weathered, his eyes burdened, and his once dark hair was now nearly completely grey. Friends and reporters observed how much weight he had lost. The toll of war, death, and national discord had etched their burden into his physique. Yet his determination remained unwavering. As victory drew near, his thoughts were not on retribution, but on healing. In his second inaugural address delivered in March 1865, Lincoln spoke not with a sense of triumph, but with dignity. He did not indulge in self-congratulation. Rather, he extended words of reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he urged the nation to mend its wounds and care for those who had endured suffering on both sides. It was one of his most eloquent speeches, serene, modest, and profoundly human. Then on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war had concluded. The Union was preserved, and slavery, the institution that had long divided the nation, was finally coming to an end. Throughout the North, bells tolled and crowds celebrated. A feeling of relief and cautious optimism filled the air. People envisioned a future of reconstruction and reunion. Lincoln began to formulate plans not only to restore the South, but to reimagine what America could evolve into. Unfortunately, he would never have the opportunity. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. While seated in his theater box, a notorious actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth entered and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He passed away the following morning, April 15th, with his wife Mary by his side and the nation in mourning. He had lived to witness the end of the war, but not the peace that would ensue. When Abraham Lincoln died, the nation did not merely lose a president, it lost its moral compass. News of his passing spread like a chilling breeze across the country. In the North, people openly wept in the streets. Church bells tolled for hours, businesses shuttered, entire cities fell silent. Even those who had previously criticized him now spoke of his greatness with deep respect. His remains were placed in an elaborate funeral train that traveled from Washington, D.C. back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. Along the way, thousands gathered along the tracks, standing in silence as the train went by. Men took off their hats. Women held their children tightly. This was not merely an expression of sorrow. It was a farewell to the man who had united them during the nation's most challenging times. Lincoln was interred in Oak Ridge Cemetery, close to the town where he had once practiced law as a young man. His grave would soon be marked by a grand monument, and eventually his likeness would be carved in stone at Mount Rushmore and featured on currency. Yet beneath all the marble and legends lay a man, a genuine individual who struggled with depression, who experienced grief deeply, and who never considered himself remarkable. Nevertheless, he transformed everything. Lincoln did not live to witness the full effects of his efforts. He never experienced the challenges of Reconstruction or the lengthy civil rights movement that would emerge over a century later. However, the seeds he sowed through his speeches, legislation, and moral clarity continued to flourish. He reminded America of its aspirations, not perfection but improvement, not division but unity, not motivated by hatred or fear, but by compassion, reason, and bravery. Today we honor Lincoln as the great liberator, the protector of the Union, the man who led with both strength and kindness. Yet perhaps what truly defines his greatness is not solely his actions, but his character. A boy who read by candlelight, a lawyer who communicated with integrity, a leader who never lost sight of humanity. His existence serves as a reminder that true greatness does not necessitate perfection. Rather, it requires purpose, integrity, and a heart that steadfastly adheres to righteousness. In this manner, Abraham Lincoln continues to embody the ideals he helped to cultivate and the quiet strength he bequeathed. For many, the term Viking evokes images of fierce warriors wielding axes and adorned with horned helmets, attacking villages and incinerating everything in their path. However, the reality, as is often the case with history, is far more intricate and captivating. The Vikings were not a monolithic group or empire. They were Norsemen, maritime tribes hailing from present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, who thrived between the late 8th and early 11th centuries. Interestingly, they did not refer to themselves as Vikings. The word Viking functioned more as a verb than a proper noun. To go Viking signified embarking on an expedition, whether for trade or for plunder. They were engaged in various occupations: farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, and storytellers. They cultivated goats and wheat, constructed wooden halls, and worshipped deities such as Odin and Thor, believing that their destinies were intricately woven by unseen forces, the Norns, who oversaw every individual. The majority of Viking men were not warriors. They were laborers, robust, skilled, and profoundly connected to their land. Yet when crops failed, when fjords froze, or when opportunities beckoned from across the sea, many would seize their shields and swords. Their motivations were not rooted in a thirst for blood. Rather, they were propelled by the imperatives of survival and ambition. Their existence was characterized by harsh winters, brief summers, and a relentless battle against the forces of nature. However, they demonstrated remarkable adaptability, exhibiting fierce determination and an insatiable curiosity. They navigated treacherous waters that instilled fear in others. They ventured into uncharted territories. They interacted with cultures that were vastly different from their own. Some took on the role of merchants, traversing the rivers of Eastern Europe to engage in trade of silk and spices with the Byzantines. Others established settlements in distant lands such as Ireland, France, and even Russia. To those they confronted, they were perceived as barbarians, disruptors of tranquility. Yet in their own eyes they were courageous explorers, forging a future in a world that frequently offered them little. It is simplistic to categorize them solely as raiders, to envision them as nothing more. Their true narrative is far more intricate, more human. Before we accompany them across oceans into conflicts and myths, we must first acknowledge that the Vikings were not monsters. They were individuals, and they were on the brink of transforming the world. If there was one unparalleled advantage the Vikings possessed, it was their ships. Sleek, elongated, and elegantly crafted, the Viking longship was more than just a means of transportation. It represented freedom, fear, and potential. Constructed from oak and meticulously assembled, these vessels were both resilient and adaptable. The wooden planks overlapped like the scales of a fish, secured with iron rivets and sealed with animal hair and tar to protect against the frigid, salty sea, their design enabled. The hulls to flex with the waves rather than resist them, providing the long ships with remarkable stability in turbulent waters. Each vessel was an engineering marvel. The typical longship had the capacity to transport 40 to 60 warriors, along with provisions, tools, and weaponry. However, what rendered them so feared and effective was not merely their size or speed, it was their versatility. Viking ships were capable of traversing the open ocean and then silently navigating up narrow rivers. They could sail in just a meter of water, allowing them to strike deep inland where they were least expected. Furthermore, they did not require harbors or docks to land, a stretch of beach, a shallow bank, or even a rocky shore sufficed. By the time villagers noticed them, the Vikings had already disembarked. At the bow of many ships was a carved figurehead, often depicting a dragon or serpent, intended to intimidate both foes and malevolent spirits. As the ships drew near, the sea appeared to churn beneath their prows, their sails filled with wind, their crews silent yet prepared. Sight of a long ship on the horizon became a source of nightmares throughout Europe. It signified that trouble was imminent. Rapid, unexpected, and merciless. However, not all long ships were employed for warfare. Some served as merchant vessels, broader and deeper to accommodate goods. Others were designated for exploration, sailing westward to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The long ship represented more than just a vessel. It symbolized freedom, a means to escape poverty, pursue glory, or discover a new home. With their ships, the Vikings were unconfined by borders. The ocean was their highway, and every horizon was an invitation. The world first truly recognized the Vikings on a tranquil summer day in the year 793. The events commenced on the sacred island of Lindisfarne, located just off the northeastern coast of England. For many years, monks had resided there in tranquility, engaged in copying manuscripts, praying, and tending to their flocks. It was a revered location, characterized by silence, learning, and devotion. Then the ships arrived, long, slender, and unfamiliar. They cut through the sea with a terrifying elegance. There was no warning, no negotiations, and no opportunity to prepare. The Vikings landed swiftly. Their axes gleamed, their shields clashed, and within moments the monastery, once a haven of peace, transformed into a scene of turmoil. The monks were defenseless. They had no soldiers, no fortifications, and no foreknowledge of the impending attack. Some were slain, while others were captured as slaves. The church was ransacked. Gold, silver, and sacred relics were taken away. This was not merely a theft, it was a profound shock. The people of Christian Europe had believed their holy sites were safeguarded by divine intervention. Yet here were these unfamiliar men from the north, invoking gods of thunder rather than Christ. News of the assault spread rapidly, inscribed in fear and disbelief. The wrath of the Northmen, one chronicler noted, is upon us. To the English, the Vikings appeared as demons, merciless, bloodthirsty, and devoid of godliness. However, to the Vikings, it represented something entirely different. They perceived unguarded wealth, abundant and ripe for the taking, and they seized it. Lindisfarne was merely the beginning. In the ensuing decades, Viking raids became increasingly common, not only in England but also throughout Ireland, Scotland, and the coasts of France. They attacked monasteries, ports, and villages swiftly, often before anyone had the chance to respond. Their intent was not to destroy for the sake of destruction. They sought silver, spices, livestock, and slaves to ensure their survival, to acquire wealth, and indeed at times to demonstrate their bravery. For a Viking warrior, a successful raid signified honor, a portion of treasure, and a name that would be celebrated in halls illuminated by fire. However, these initial raids ignited something much larger. They transformed the perception of the North in the world. Furthermore, they heralded the onset of an era when no coastline was ever genuinely secure again. Although history frequently depicts Vikings as savage raiders, this is merely one facet of the narrative. Shortly after the first waves of raids surged across the European coasts, an intriguing development occurred. The Vikings did not always depart. They remained, they constructed, they evolved into settlers. In Ireland, towns such as Dublin and Wexford originated as Viking outposts. These were basic camps where raiders could recuperate, mend their vessels, and ready themselves for the subsequent assault. Yet as time passed, these camps expanded. Markets emerged, dwellings were erected, families were established. The raiders had transformed into inhabitants. This pattern repeated itself in northern England. the Vikings established a region known as the Danelaw. This was land under Norse authority, where Viking law prevailed over English governance. In Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands became bastions of Norse power. Even in present-day Russia, Vikings, referred to there as the Rus, navigated the rivers and began to dominate Slavic towns, founding trade hubs that would eventually evolve into cities like Kiev. However, one of the most significant transformations occurred in France. In 911, a Viking chieftain named Rollo negotiated an agreement with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. Rollo had been conducting raids in northern France for several years. His fleet launched an assault along the river Seine, yet rather than perpetuating the cycle of violence, Charles proposed land in return for peace. Rollo consented, and the area became recognized as Normandy, the territory of the Northmen. In this region, Norse culture gradually merged with Frankish traditions. The Vikings embraced Christianity, adopting local customs, languages, and agricultural practices. Within a few generations, their descendants would identify as fully French, while still retaining the heritage of their Viking ancestry. This trend was evident throughout the Viking realm. The same hands that once wielded axes transitioned to cultivating the land. The same vessels that transporting warriors now carried grain, textiles, and tools. The sword was replaced by the plough. Viking settlers intermarried with indigenous populations, acquiring new languages. They brought their deities with them, though some were eventually abandoned. They did not merely invade, they transformed the lands they touched. The portrayal of the fierce, unruly Viking conceals a more profound reality. They were not solely the destroyers of kingdoms, they were also the architects of new ones. To comprehend the Vikings, one must grasp their beliefs. For behind every raid, every journey, and every final gasp on the battlefield lay a conviction in something greater, something eternal. The Norse cosmos was populated with gods, giants, spirits, and the concept of fate. They held the belief that life was not a series of random events, but rather intricately woven by three enigmatic entities known as the Norns. These sisters resided at the base of the world tree, Yggdrasil, spinning the fates of every individual. At the heart of this mythological universe was Odin, the All-Father, a one-eyed deity of wisdom, warfare, and poetry. Odin had sacrificed one of his eyes in exchange for knowledge, perpetually in search of understanding, much like the Vikings themselves. Additionally, there was Thor, the god of thunder, who wielded his formidable hammer, Mjolnir. He safeguarded both gods and humans from the forces of chaos, charging into battle with lightning trailing behind him. Many Vikings donned Thor's hammer as an amulet, symbolizing strength and bravery. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, also held a significant position. It was believed that she took half of the souls of fallen warriors to her hall, while the remaining half ascended to Odin's grand hall, Valhalla. Valhalla. For the Vikings, death was not a source of fear. If a man fell valiantly in battle, Valkyries, the warrior maidens of Odin, would carry him to the golden halls of Valhalla, where he would feast, fight, and celebrate for eternity. However, if a warrior succumbed to illness, cowardice, or old age, he would not enter Valhalla. Instead, he would drift into a quieter, lesser afterlife. To die without honor was the ultimate tragedy. This belief influenced the way Vikings lived. They embraced risk. They confronted battle with valor, not out of a lack of fear of death, but in the hope of securing a place in the afterlife. Their myths were not mere tales. They served as teachings. They were guides on how to live with dignity, confront adversity, and face death without flinching. For the Norse, the gods were not remote. They were nearby, observing, waiting. And when a Viking raised his sword and charged into peril, he was not alone. It is one of the most recognizable images in popular culture. A Viking warrior, towering and fierce, with a snarling beard and a helmet embellished with large curved horns. It appears intimidating. It seems bold. Yet it is a misconception. The belief that Vikings wore horned helmets is a myth. One that originated not from archaeological evidence but from art and theatre centuries after the Viking era had concluded. No Viking helmet with horns has ever been discovered. None are depicted in carvings, tapestries, or accounts from that period. The helmets that have been unearthed, such as the renowned one found in Gunbu, Norway, are straightforward, functional and crafted from iron, rounded, reinforced and snug-fitting. Designed for practicality, not for intimidation. So where did the horned imagery originate? The origins trace back to the 1800s during the Romantic era, a time when artists and composers developed a fascination with ancient myths and warrior cultures. Richard Wagner in particular created his renowned operas centered around Norse gods and heroes, prompting costume designers to craft a look that complemented the dramatic narratives. They incorporated horns into the design. These theatrical helmets appeared formidable on stage, enhancing the singer's larger-than-life presence. Audiences were captivated, and thus the image became entrenched in popular culture. Literature, paintings, and subsequently Hollywood films adopted this imagery. Horned helmets evolved into a representation of untamed strength, serving as a shorthand for Vikings. However, actual Viking warriors would have deemed such helmets absurd. In battle, horns would have rendered them easy targets. The horns could entangle with weapons, become lodged in doorways, or disrupt balance during combat. Vikings were pragmatic individuals. Their equipment was crafted for survival rather than aesthetics. This does not imply they lacked artistic sensibility. Their weapons and armor were frequently adorned with intricate carvings of knotwork and animals. Their ships featured dragon heads, and their jewelry held profound significance. Yet in the context of warfare, practicality was paramount. Nevertheless, the myth persists. It appears in cartoons, costumes, and football team logos. Such a striking image is difficult to dispel, even when historical accounts present a contrasting narrative. The reality is far more intriguing than the myth. The true Vikings did not require horns to instill fear. They possessed skill, strategy, and an ominous silence before the storm that no helmet could encapsulate. The Vikings were not merely raiders or settlers. They were explorers, restless, inquisitive, and unafraid of the unknown. While much of Europe regarded the sea as a barrier, the Norse perceived it as a pathway, a challenge indeed, but never an obstacle. Motivated by overpopulation, scarce farmland, and the allure of wealth, Viking explorers ventured beyond the familiar boundaries of the map. Their long ships, which were fast, light, and highly maneuverable, enabled them to venture into territories that others feared to explore. Initially, they navigated westward to the British Isles, then further to the untamed coast of Ireland and the rugged shores of Scotland. Before long, they stumbled upon the windswept Faroe Islands, followed by the discovery of a vast, uncharted land known as Iceland. In the late 9th century, Norse families began to establish settlements in Iceland. There they constructed farms, formed a parliament, and composed sagas, tales of deities, spirits, and heroic journeys. However, even Iceland proved insufficient for their ambitions. By the late 10th century, Eric the Red, a daring and exiled chieftain, departed from Iceland and arrived at a sprawling icy coastline which he named Greenland in hopes that the appealing name would draw settlers. His strategy succeeded, but the most remarkable voyage was yet to come. Around the year 1000, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, embarked on an even more ambitious journey westward. He landed on a new territory characterized by forests, grasslands, and grapevines, which the Norse referred to as Vinland. Most historians agree that Vinland corresponds to present-day Newfoundland in Canada. Leif and his crew established a modest settlement, now recognized as Lance Omeos, marking the first known European presence in North America, occurring nearly 500 years prior to Columbus's voyage from Spain. Nevertheless, the Norse presence in Vinland was short-lived. Conflicts with indigenous populations, severe winters, and the considerable distance from their homeland ultimately compelled them to forsake the settlement. Yet they had achieved a monumental feat. They had traversed the Atlantic and returned. Their expeditions were not solely focused on conquest. They were driven by the pursuit of new possibilities. The Vikings explored the rivers of Eastern Europe, engaged in trade with the Byzantine Empire, and journeyed through deserts and forests in search of something greater. They were not always certain of their destination, yet they proceeded regardless. In a realm constrained by fear, the Norse spirit flowed with the current, perpetually seeking what lies beyond. No era endures indefinitely, not even one born of wind and sea. By the mid-11th century, the Viking world began to transform, initially at a slow pace, then suddenly. The raids that once terrorized the European coasts started to diminish. The longships continued to navigate the waters, but they now transporting more merchandise than warriors. The same hands that once wielded axes were now engaged in signing treaties, trading furs and kneeling in prayer. Gradually, the ancient pagan beliefs yielded to Christianity. Missionaries had arrived years prior, some as captives, others as honored guests. Over time, their impact expanded. Kings and chieftains began to convert not solely for spiritual motives, but also for alliances, legitimacy, and harmony with their Christian neighbors. With the advent of religion came organization, and with organization emerged kingdoms. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, robust central monarchies began to form. Local chiefs were supplanted by royal law. Raiding transitioned into taxation. The fierce independence that once characterized Viking society was being molded by order. Concurrently, European defenses were enhanced. Castles emerged along the coastlines. Towns reinforced their fortifications. The element of surprise, which had been vital to Viking raids, was dissipating. The world was simply becoming more challenging for Vikings to prosper in. One of the concluding chapters unfolded in 1066. A formidable Norse king named Harald Hardrada sailed to England with aspirations of reclaiming a throne. He fought valiantly at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but ultimately lost his life in combat. Just a few weeks later, another invasion occurred, this time led by William, Duke of Normandy, who was himself a descendant of Vikings. He took control of England not as a raider, but as a monarch. The Viking Age had come full circle. From seafaring raiders to crowned sovereigns, from oral legends to written statutes. Then the sails disappeared from view. However, while the raids ceased, the legacy persisted in place names, languages, bloodlines, the fierce independence of Iceland, and in the stones etched with runes that continue to whisper their tales. The era of the Vikings had concluded, yet their spirit, bold, inquisitive, and relentless, had already transformed the world, and a part of that spirit still quietly navigates beneath the surface of our history. The sails have vanished, the oars have ceased. The longships now rest in museums and burial mounds. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Vikings continues to flow quietly through the world. They did not leave an empire in the conventional sense, nor did they construct towering ruins or marble temples. Yet their influence is deeply embedded in the very fabric of modern Europe and beyond. In England, more than 1,000 towns and villages carry Norse names. Terms such as knife, sky, window, and berserk originate directly from the Old Norse language. Even the days of the week, Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Freya, serve as reminders that the gods of the Vikings still resonate in the calendars we follow. In Ireland, cities like Dublin were established by Norse settlers, initially as ports for plunder, later evolving into trading centers, and ultimately flourishing as medieval communities. In France, the Normans, descendants of Viking settlers, would go on to influence the history of Europe through warfare and governance, most notably in 1066, when William the Conqueror seized the English crown. In Iceland, their language remains nearly unchanged, so closely resembling Old Norse that ancient sagas can still be recited with minimal translation. These sagas, inscribed on parchment under the flickering glow of candlelight, encapsulate the myths, values, and aspirations of a people long departed, yet never entirely forgotten. However, their legacy transcends mere history. It embodies culture, it evokes emotion. The Viking ethos of audacity, resilience, and inquisitiveness has evolved into a global symbol. Literature, cinema, video games, and television series persist in reinterpreting their narratives, often blending myth with reality. Nevertheless, an element of authenticity persists in their representation. The exhilarating sense of freedom in confronting storms directly, in traversing boundaries that others dread. We recall the Vikings not solely for their brutality but for their humanity, as individuals who embraced life fully in a world that demanded fortitude and sacrifice. They were poets and adventurers, marauders and monarchs, parents and storytellers, seekers of knowledge. Although the Viking era has concluded, its influence continues to wash over the shores of our culture, softly reminding us that the sea was never the conclusion of their existence. It was merely the commencement. Long before the initial Spanish vessels graced the horizon, there existed a city that appeared to challenge the very forces of nature. Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, emerged from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a vision. A realm of stone and symmetry, constructed on islands and linked by grand causeways, it was unlike anything the Europeans had ever conceived. Established in 1325, as per legend, the Aztecs were led there by a prophecy to discover an eagle perched on a cactus consuming a serpent. That vision manifested on a marshy lake bed, and there they erected their empire, stone by stone, canal by canal. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan had evolved into one of the largest cities globally, boasting over 200,000 residents. The avenues of the city were broad and well maintained. Its canals were alive with the activity of canoes. The city sparkled with its white structures, lively marketplaces and impressive temples. At the center of it all was the Temple Mare, a grand double pyramid that soared towards the heavens. One side was devoted to Huitzilopochtli, the deity of war and the sun, while the other was dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. Offerings, prayers, and occasionally blood were presented to maintain the equilibrium between the earth and the sky. Life within the empire was meticulously organized. Nobles, priests, warriors, merchants, and farmers each had their designated roles. Children were taught to interpret pictographs. Tributes streamed in from surrounding regions, including cacao, feathers, obsidian, jade, maize, and more. The empire flourished through warfare, commerce, and religious practices. Throughout this, one individual rose to prominence. Moctezuma II, the emperor, sovereign, and divine representative of the gods on earth. He was wise, prudent, and profoundly spiritual, living in the company of advisors and omens. His rule extended beyond a mere city, encompassing a complex and advanced civilization that spanned central Mexico. However, the Aztecs did not govern in tranquility. Numerous neighboring tribes harbored resentment towards their dominance, their demands for tribute, and their human sacrifices. Beneath the facade of wealth and ritual, old grievances and tensions simmered. Far beyond the mountains and lakes, across an ocean unknown to the Aztecs, ships had embarked on their journey. They bore foreign weapons, alien beliefs, and an insatiable desire for gold and glory. Tenochtitlan stood tall, proud, and unwavering. Yet ominous clouds were beginning to form. In 1519, a fleet of 11 ships arrived at the shores of the Yucatan Peninsula. From these vessels emerged Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador lacking a royal title, a formidable army, and any authorization to conquer an empire. However, what he lacked in authority, he compensated for with shrewd ambition and a perilous form of charisma. Cortés arrived with just over 500 soldiers, a few cannons, 16 horses, and a profound conviction that both God and gold were in his favor. What he encountered in the New World, however, was far beyond his expectations. As the Spaniards advanced inland, they faced fierce opposition from native peoples, but also found allies. Numerous indigenous groups resented the dominance of the Aztecs. They had paid tribute for many years, witnessed their sons being taken as sacrifices, and yearned for liberation. Cortés recognized an opportunity. He engaged in combat indeed, but more frequently he opted for negotiation. In these initial days, he acquired something far more precious than weapons or gold. He gained Mayans, also referred to as Lamalin, a native woman skilled in language and intelligence. She became his translator, cultural advisor, and ultimately his closest confidant. Through her, Cortés was able to communicate with the people. Through her, he could instill fear, create alliances, and unravel the complexities of a world he did not comprehend. As the Spaniards traveled westward, They heard tales of a powerful empire in the mountains, of cities constructed of gold, of magnificent temples, and of a king who ruled with divine authority. For the Spaniards, these stories only intensified their ambition. To the individuals they encountered along their journey, Cortés promised an end to Aztec oppression. He set fire to his ships to eliminate any chance of retreat. He advanced with an increasing number of forces now bolstered by thousands of indigenous allies. Gradually, step by step, he approached the core of the empire. In Tenochtitlan, Montezuma received news of these unusual men. Pale-skinned, bearded, clad in metal, and riding creatures that no one had ever seen before. Some believed they were deities. Others perceived a more ominous sign. As Cortés ascended the mountain paths, accompanied by allies and equipped with firepower, both the emperor and the conquistador readied themselves for a meeting that would alter the course of history. One governed an empire, while the other sought to dismantle it. On November 8, 1519, the two men confronted each other for the first time. Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, clad in armor and resolute, supported by foreign armaments and indigenous allies, faced Montezuma II, the divine emperor of the Aztecs, adorned in feathers and gold, sovereign of a city that shimmered like a gem in the lake. This encounter was not merely a meeting of individuals, it represented a clash of civilizations. Upon entering Tenochtitlan, Cortés and his troops were awestruck. The city extended for miles, its white temples towering above turquoise canals and bustling markets. It was more pristine, expansive, and advanced than any city they had encountered in Europe. Some Spaniards murmured that they had stepped into a dream. Montezuma greeted them not with weapons, but with ceremonial hospitality. He offered gifts of gold, sustenance, and exquisite cloaks. He extended words of peace and accommodated Cortés in a royal palace. According to Spanish accounts, he may have even bowed, though the significance of that gesture to Montezuma and its interpretation by the Spaniards may remain forever ambiguous. For Montezuma, this was a moment of great delicacy. The omens had been ominous, lightning striking temples, enigmatic visions in the sky, and whispers of strange men arriving from the east. His priests were apprehensive about the return of Quetzalcoatl, a deity who, as per legend, would emerge from the sea. Montezuma was a contemplative leader, yet also prudent. He might have believed that diplomacy was the sole means to avert violence. Alternatively, he may have wished to gather more information before taking decisive action. Regardless of his motivations, he opted to welcome Cortés as a distinguished guest rather than as an invader. However, to Cortés, the reception signified a display of weakness. He perceived wealth rather than rituals. An empire ready for conquest, not a sovereign city extending hospitality. The two individuals could only communicate through multiple layers of translation, from their native tongues to Mayan and then to Spanish. Words were selected with care, yet meanings frequently eluded comprehension. Respect was misinterpreted as submission. Rituals were confused with fear. The Spanish thought they had established dominance. The Aztecs believed they were preserving equilibrium. In that moment of misguided understanding, the seeds of catastrophe were subtly planted, and beneath the towering temples, the gradual disintegration of a civilization had already commenced. Initially, the Spaniards were esteemed guests in Tenochtitlan, accommodated in an opulent palace, provided with the finest delicacies of the empire, and allowed to traverse the city at will. Cortés wandered its streets, examined its temples, and observed its inhabitants. He was intrigued, yet not deceived. Beneath his admiration lay calculation. Cortés was aware of his precarious situation. His forces, although increasing, were still significantly outnumbered. The Aztecs were proud, well-organized, and militarily formidable. Should Montezuma issue the command, the Spaniards could be annihilated in a single night. Thus, Cortés took the initiative, not through brute force but through cunning strategy. He placed Montezuma under house arrest. It was not a dramatic takeover. The emperor remained in his palace, still adorned in gold, still treated with respect. However, guards were now stationed at every entrance. The man who had governed an empire could no longer roam his own city freely. To the Spanish, this was a masterstroke. By controlling Montezuma, they believed they had control over the empire, and for a period that illusion appeared to be genuine. The emperor remained passive. Some say he was resigned. Others contend he sought to avert a full-scale conflict. Perhaps he still held the belief that the Spaniards could be persuaded to depart. Alternatively, he may have started to lose faith, not only in diplomacy, but also in the deities themselves. While imprisoned, Montezuma continued to address his people from the palace roof. He reassured them that the Spaniards intended no harm. He implored for tranquility, yet calm was disintegrating. The Aztecs became increasingly restless. Whispers escalated into anger. The streets, once vibrant with trade and song, were now laden with tension. Many no longer regarded Montezuma as a leader. He had permitted foreign invaders into their sacred city. He had not fought back. He had yielded too much. Cortés too began to perceive the change. His alliance with the emperor rested on unstable ground, and beneath him, the foundation of Aztec authority was starting to fracture. Nevertheless, no blood had yet been shed within the heart of the city. There remained a chance, albeit slim and fragile, to avert catastrophe. However, the distinction between diplomacy and domination had already become indistinct, and soon a single act of violence would obliterate it entirely. While Hernán Cortés was away from Tenochtitlan, having marched to the coast to confront a Spanish rival sent to detain him, he entrusted his second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado, with the governance of the city. Alvarado was not Cortés. Where Cortés employed diplomacy and restraint, Alvarado governed with suspicion and fear. During Cortés's absence, the Aztecs prepared to celebrate one of their most sacred festivals, Toxcat, a ritual honoring the god Tezcatlipoca, lord of the night and fate. It was a time of music, dancing, and ceremony held within the courtyard of the Templo. Nobles, priests, and warriors assembled in full regalia, adorned with feathers and gold. However, to Alvarado, it appeared to be an insurrection. He claimed to have heard rumors of a rebellion, although no attack had materialized. Paranoia clouded his judgment. He feared the Aztecs were getting ready to strike. Thus, he initiated the first strike. As the dancers performed and drums resonated into the sky, Spanish soldiers invaded the courtyard. They blocked the exits, then without warning they began to kill. They cut down unarmed men, priests, and nobles alike, slashing through the crowd with swords and spears. The blood of the city's most honored citizens soaked the temple stones. Those who tried to flee were cut down. Those who resisted were slaughtered. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. The music stopped. The city fell silent, and then the silence turned to fury. When Cortés returned days later, he found a city transformed. The people, once cautious, were now enraged. The illusion of peace was gone. The Aztecs surrounded the Spanish quarters, blocking the causeways, cutting off supplies. Tenochtitlan had become a trap, a boiling cage of stone and lake water. Inside, Montezuma, still a prisoner, could no longer calm his people. Many no longer listened. Some no longer even believed he ruled. The empire had entered a moment without balance, without direction. Rage filled the void. Cortés tried to salvage what he could. He spoke to Montezuma. He offered gifts. He pleaded for calm, but what had been spilled in the temple could not be swept away. The gods had been insulted, the ancestors shamed. The sacred blood of a civilization had been spilled, and it would demand an answer. Trapped inside a city that once welcomed them, the Spaniards now lived behind barricades. Their food dwindled. Their allies died, their hopes narrowed to a single thought. Escape. Cortés tried diplomacy one last time. He brought Montezuma to the palace rooftop, hoping the emperor could calm the crowds, but the people no longer listened. Some hurled stones. One struck Montezuma in the head. Days later, he died in silence under Spanish Watch, his death marked the final break. The last symbol of peace had fallen. On June 30th, 1520, Cortés made his move. Under a moonless sky, rain pouring from the heavens, the Spaniards and their native allies began slipping out of the city, carrying with them what they could: weapons, supplies, and gold. Too much gold. Greed slowed them. Armor weighed them down. The causeways, narrow bridges over the lake, became bottlenecks. The Aztecs were waiting. From canoes and rooftops, warriors launched their attack. Arrows rained down. Spears pierced the dark. Some Spaniards slipped on the wet stone and fell into the lake, dragged down by their treasures. Others were captured alive, their fate sealed atop the same pyramids they once marveled at. Cortés fought to maintain order, but chaos ruled. Bodies filled the water. Screams cut through the rain. In the darkness, no one knew who lived or died. By dawn, the survivors reached the far shore, bloodied, broken, and hollow-eyed. Cortés sat beneath a tree and wept. This night would be remembered as La Triste, the night of sorrows. Hundreds of Spaniards were dead. Thousands of native allies had perished. The dream of conquest seemed shattered, but it was not the end. Cortés regrouped. The survivors limped toward El Cala, where they rested and rebuilt. More allies joined him, drawn by the shared hatred of the Aztec Empire. Despite being battered, the Spanish maintained their weapons, their steel, and their unwavering determination. However, something else had already infiltrated Tenochtitlan, unseen, silent, and far more deadly. As swords clashed and causeways ran red with blood, a single infected individual had left a legacy far more destructive than gold or fire. Smallpox had arrived, and it would accomplish what weapons could not. While the Spanish lamented their losses and sought to regain their strength, an unseen invader was already operating within the core of the Aztec Empire. Smallpox. It arrived quietly, clinging to the breath and skin of one infected man, a black slave who had accompanied the Spanish forces. Initially no one noticed, just a cough, a fever, a rash, but then it began to spread. Tenochtitlan, once vibrant with color, sound, and life, started to fall silent. Entire families were decimated within days. Children, priests, warriors, all struck down without warning. The deceased filled homes and temples. The living, too weak to bury them, began to lose hope. The Aztecs had never encountered such a disease. Their healers were powerless, and their gods provided no solace. Panic ensued, followed by despair. As many as half of the city's population perished, not from warfare but from illness. Among the deceased was Cuitlahuac, Montezuma's brother and successor, whose reign had lasted a mere 80 days. The empire, now leaderless and reeling, selected a new ruler, a young noble imbued with fire in his spirit and defiance in his heart. Meanwhile, Cortés returned more powerful than ever, commanding over 100,000 native allies, including the fierce Tlaxcalans. To many tribes, the Aztecs had been tyrannical overlords. Now they perceived an opportunity to liberate themselves, even if it meant allying with the Spaniards. In May 1521, Cortés initiated the siege of Tenochtitlan. Initially he obstructed the causeways. Subsequently, with brigantine ships gathered on the lake, he blockaded the waters, isolating the city from its food and resources. Day by day, street by street, the Spaniards and their allies advanced through the capital. The Aztecs resisted with all their might. Even in a state of starvation and illness, they fought from rooftops, from canals, and from the last sacred spaces of their city. They transformed temples into fortifications and maize fields into battlegrounds. However, they could not halt the siege. What the sword had initiated, disease had exacerbated, and hunger would soon conclude. By the time the final assault commenced, Tenochtitlan was no longer the radiant city Cortés had initially encountered. It had become a mere shadow of its former self, shattered, ablaze, yet still refusing to submit. Not yet. By August of 1521, the city of Tenochtitlan, once a representation of order, beauty, and divine purpose, had turned into a graveyard. The canals that once sparkled with sunlight and commerce now flowed dark with filth and blood. The causeways were congested with corpses. The floating gardens languished in silence. Smoke ascended from temples that had endured for centuries. For 93 days, the Aztecs had persevered, hungry, ill, and encircled. They had battled with sharpened stones, obsidian blades, and sheer determination. Their new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, refused to capitulate. Even as his people succumbed to exhaustion, he maintained faith in the sanctity of their cause. Yet the siege was unyielding. Spanish cannons shattered stone walls. Their brigantines dominated the lake, thousands of native allies overwhelmed the defenders. No assistance arrived, no miracle occurred, and ultimately on August 13th, 1521, the combat ceased. Cuauhtémoc was apprehended. As he tried to escape by canoe, presented before Cortés, he reportedly spoke with dignity. "I have fulfilled my duty in defense of my people. Now I am your captive. Take this dagger and end my life." Cortés spared him for the time being, possibly recognizing the significance of a living emblem of conquest. However, the city was lost. Tenochtitlan, once home to over 200,000 inhabitants, was reduced to ashes and ruins. The temples were plundered. Sacred decks were obliterated. Survivors were enslaved or left to perish among the debris. The lake that had once sustained the city was filled in and buried under the weight of empire. In its stead, Cortés would commence the construction of Mexico City, a new capital for a new colony, established atop the remnants of a fallen civilization. Yet something had also perished within the Spaniards, the awe they once experienced upon their initial entry into the city had been supplanted by silence, by scorched stone, by the echoes of what once existed. The conquest was concluded, the victory was absolute, and yet the toll on both the conqueror and the conquered was incalculable. The Aztec Empire, with its deities, its beauty, and its contradictions, was no longer, but the narrative, the memory, the weight of it would endure eternally. The Aztec Empire has vanished. Its temples lie in ruins, buried beneath asphalt and stone. Its kings are mute. Its gods are no longer venerated in firelit temples, and its capital, Tenochtitlan, exists solely in the recollections of chroniclers and the remnants beneath Mexico City. Yet even in devastation, something persists. You can perceive it in the language. Nahuatl, the tongue of the Aztecs, is still spoken by over 1 million individuals in Mexico today. Its words endure in daily life. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote. Sounds that once resonated in the halls of emperors now circulate among farmers and children. You can sense it in the art. Intricate designs, serpent motifs, eagle feathers sculpted in stone. Echoes of a culture that perceived the divine in every mountain, river, and sky. In museums and markets, the aesthetics of Aztec life continue to inspire. You can savor it in the cuisine. Maize, chili, cacao. Sacred staples that nourished a civilization now nourish the world, and you can observe it in the people. Descendants of the Mexica and other Nahua peoples traverse the streets of Mexico today, their heritage woven quietly into their features, their crafts, their narratives. Although the Spaniards constructed over the ruins, they could not obliterate the essence of what preceded. And while the conquest was rapid, brutal, and devastating, it did not signify the end of the Aztec spirit. It was a transformation, compelled, painful, yet never complete. Indigenous traditions adapted, persisted in secrecy, merged with the new to forge something entirely distinctive. The fall of the Aztec Empire is frequently recalled as a cautionary tale, a clash of worlds, a collision of ambition and misunderstanding. but it also serves as a lesson in resilience. Despite all the gold seized and the blood shed, the Spaniards could not erase the memory. They could not silence the volcanoes that once overlooked Tenochtitlan. They could not obliterate the stories recounted in murals, in chants, in hushed prayers to the ancient gods. And in the shadows of Mexico's cathedrals and its government edifices, stones from ancient temples still rest, silent and observant. Time may have concealed the empire, but its heart continues to pulse beneath the soil, within the people, and in the narratives we persist in sharing. For the soldiers of World War I, the trenches represented more than just a battlefield. They represented a way of life. Deeply etched into the European terrain, they extended from the Belgian coastline to the Swiss frontier. They created a zigzagging web of mud, blood and wire. When soldiers first entered the trenches, many believed it would be a temporary situation. They envisioned a swift conflict, lasting a few weeks or perhaps months. They did not anticipate years of mud-soaked silence, with frozen fingers clutching rifles and sleeping mere inches from death. The trenches were constricted, often just wide enough for two men to pass each other. The ground, churned by boots and rain, transformed into a thick mixture of water and decay. Boards were placed to create duckboards, but they merely floated atop the filth instead of remedying it. In certain areas, soldiers stood ankle-deep in water for days, their skins softening, blistering, and turning grey. This was the origin of trench foot, a condition that rendered feet numb, swollen, and ultimately black. In extreme cases, toes had to be amputated. Above them, barbed wire twisted in every direction. An endless snarl intended to halt the enemy and ensnare the unwary. Just beyond it lay no man's land, the dead zone between trenches filled with shell craters, shattered trees, and corpses that no one dared to retrieve. Even when the guns fell silent, death was perpetually close. Snipers lay in wait for any movement above the parapet. Artillery strikes occurred without warning, transforming calm into chaos in mere seconds. The air was thick with the stench of decay, unwashed bodies, and damp earth. Rats flourished, growing plump on the remains of fallen soldiers. Lice burrowed into clothing and skin, causing incessant itching and spreading illness. Sleep came in fleeting moments. Food was served cold. Mail was a precious commodity, yet the men adapted. They dug deeper, constructed shelters from sandbags and scrap metal, shared cigarettes, and fashioned makeshift furniture from broken crates. They exchanged jokes, pennied letters, and waited day after day. In the trenches, survival was not merely a physical challenge, it was a mental one. It involved clinging to one's identity, humor, and hope, even as the world disintegrated around them. It was not the front lines that shattered most men. It was the slow, unending grind of existence behind the mud and the wire. In the bleak silence of the trenches, where mud seeped through boots and fear was ever present, there was one element that provided warmth more potent than fire, letters. Mail call was revered, a piece of paper from home, from a wife, a sweetheart, a mother, or a child, held more significance than rations or rest. It served as confirmation that life beyond the wire still thrived, that someone remembered you not merely as a soldier, but as a human being. Soldiers pennied their thoughts by candlelight, hunched in dugouts, enveloped by the scent of damp earth and tobacco. Their expressions were straightforward, at times poetic. Often delicate, they recounted the weather, the food, and the fleeting moments of tranquility. Many omitted the horrors. They did not wish to burden those at home. They aimed to shield them even as shells detonated overhead. Some wrote daily, while others did so less frequently. They addressed their wives as my dearest, their mothers as dear mom, and their children with profound affection. I hope you are well, I remain intact, I long for your voice, tell the baby I love her. Some even included pressed flowers, drawn sketches, or small trinkets discovered on the battlefield. Receiving a letter was a ceremony. Soldiers would read it once, then again, and once more. They folded it with care, tucked it into a pocket close to their chest, or concealed it in a tin to shield it from the rain. They read them aloud to one another, circulated them, and shared in each other's joy or sorrow. However, at times a letter would arrive too late. Mail could take weeks. It might arrive after its intended recipient had already perished in battle. In those instances, comrades would gather, open it slowly, and read the words aloud in the memory of the deceased. One final connection to the life he had left behind. In a war characterized by machinery and madness, where men were reduced to numbers and losses were counted in the thousands, letters served as reminders of their humanity. They acted as bridges between two worlds, one of peace and the other of war. They conveyed love, fear, longing, and hope, especially in a place where nothing felt certain. A letter, no matter how small, had the power to uplift a man's spirit. It was Christmas Eve, 1914, during the first winter of a conflict that many had anticipated would be resolved by this time. The trenches were frigid and saturated with frost. Soldiers huddled beneath blankets, reminiscing about home, warmth, and peace. Then across no man's land, an unfamiliar sound emerged, singing still. Heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night, German. Voices gently rose into the night air. British troops listened, perplexed, and then responded with their own carols. One by one, heads began to rise above the parapets. What ensued would become one of the most profoundly human moments in a profoundly inhuman war. Without orders, without any planning, soldiers began to ascend out of the trenches. They converged in the middle of no man's land, that desolate space filled with barbed wire and fallen bodies, and shook hands. Some exchanged buttons, tobacco and chocolate. Others offered sausages or plum pudding. Then someone produced a ball. A game of football commenced. Boots kicked through mud and snow, rifles left behind. The match had no score, no rules, no sides, just men sharing laughter beneath a cold winter sky. They showed each other photographs of their wives and children. They buried their dead, they lit candles and shared songs in languages they did not understand. For a fleeting moment, there was no war, no adversary. Only men, cold, weary, and longing for peace. However, this could not endure. The generals were enraged upon discovering it. Commanders issued stringent orders, prohibiting any further interaction. Artillery fire soon resumed. Snipers returned to their positions. The soldiers went back to their trenches and to the business of killing those they had just embraced. The truce was never replicated on such a scale again, yet for those who were present, it remained a memory that would not fade. A sliver of light in a war filled with darkness, a reminder that beneath every uniform was a beating heart, capable of compassion even in the most violent terrain. It did not conclude the war, but it demonstrated that even for a single day, humanity could still transcend it. And sometimes peace did not require a signature from generals. It merely needed to be chosen by men with frozen hands and open hearts. The noise of war is indelible. The roar of shells, the clattering of machine guns, the sudden final crack of a sniper's bullet. However, what many soldiers recalled most vividly was the silence. Between the battles there were long stretching hours where nothing appeared to occur. No advances, no charges, just the damp, heavy air of waiting, and it was in that stillness that the true war exacted its toll. In those quiet hours, men sat with their Thoughts, some pennied letters, some smoked until their fingers trembled. Others simply gazed at the wooden walls of the trench, eyes vacant, awaiting the next order, the next explosion, the next name to vanish. The silence was not tranquil, it was dense, unnatural, the kind of quiet that made even the birds wary. Any sound, a snapped twig, a distant cough, could be a signal, a prelude, a mistake. At night, the tension only intensified. Flares ascended like phantoms above no man's land, casting long shadows across the wire. Men whispered, fearful even of their own voices. Every hour brought the question, is this the night they come? At times, the silence would shatter unexpectedly. An artillery shell would fall indiscriminately. A scout was found entangled in the wire. A raid, sudden and brutal, concluded as swiftly as it commenced. Then the stillness would return, somehow more oppressive than before. During these intervals, soldiers mended trenches, interred the deceased, and fortified the walls. They prepared tea in dirty tins, engaged in card games with tattered decks, and recounted tales, some factual, others fabricated, merely to tether their thoughts to something beyond the mire. The silence provided no respite, only contemplation. And within that contemplation, fear took root. Men began to tally their breaths, their days, their opportunities. They listened to their heartbeats as if it were the final possession they had. Yet they remained not for honor or optimism, but because the trench was the sole existence left. Amidst the barrages, time decelerated. The war halted, but it never ceased. In those empty hours between thunder and demise, the human spirit learned to endure, not with tranquility, but with quiet perseverance. For in trench life, survival was not solely about combat, it was also about the waiting. The initial gas attack arrived like an eerie green mist. It silently wafted across the battlefield, moving low to the ground, clinging to the earth as if it were sentient. There was no forewarning, no explosion, no roar, merely a gradual, unnatural haze. And then the coughing commenced. It was April 1915 near Ypres, Belgium, when the Germans unleashed chlorine gas upon the Allied lines. Soldiers stood in shock, observing the cloud advance, not yet comprehending its nature. By the time they understood, it was too late. The gas seared the eyes and throat, transformed lungs into liquid, and caused even the strongest men to collapse to their knees, gasping like fish out of water. Panic spread more swiftly than the gas itself.